All right. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 of the J6 report. I think now we start to get into the actual plot, the scheming behind the scenes. Everything up till now was just all the lies, all the things that they knew were lies, yet kept saying. All the setup for the actual scheme. All right, Chapter 2. I just want to find 11,780 votes. In a now infamous telephone call on January 2nd, 2021, President Trump pressured Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger for more than an hour. The president confronted him with multiple conspiracy theories about the election, none of which were true. Raffensperger and other Georgia officials debunked all of these allegations one after another during their call. Under Raffensperger's leadership, Georgia had, by that time, already conducted a statewide hand recount of all ballots. That recount and other post-election reviews proved that there was no widespread fraud and that voting machines didn't alter the outcome of the election. This should have put President Trump's allegations to rest. But, undeterred by the facts, the president badgered Raffensperger to overturn the Georgia results. President Trump insisted that the ballots are corrupt and someone was shredding them. Oh, stand by. And someone was shredding them. He issued a thinly veiled threat telling Raffensperger, "It is more illegal for you than it is for them because you know what they did and you're not reporting it." Of course, the Georgia officials weren't doing anything illegal and there was nothing to report. Even so, President Trump suggested that both Raffensperger and his general counsel, Ryan Germany, could face criminal jeopardy. I think we do have to add names. That's a criminal offense, and you can't let that happen, the president said. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. I'm notifying you that you're letting it happen. And then the president made his demand. So look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, President Trump told Raffensperger. It was a stunning moment. The President of the United States was asking a state chief's election officer to find enough votes to declare him the winner of the election that he just lost. Raffensperger saw the president's warning to him on January 2nd as a threat. I felt then, and I still believe today, that this was a threat, Raffensperger wrote in his book, and this threat was multifaceted. First, the president notifying Raffensperger and his team of criminal activity could be understood as directing the law enforcement power of the federal government against them. While Raffensperger did not know for certain whether President Trump was threatening such an investigation, he knew Trump had positional power as president and appeared to be promising to make my life miserable. But the threat was also of a more insidious kind. As Raffensperger wrote in his book, others obviously thought it was a threat too, because some of Trump's more radical followers have responded as if it was their duty to carry out this threat. Raffensperger's deputy held a press conference and publicly warned all Americans, including President Trump, that President Trump's rhetoric endangered innocent officials and private citizens, and fueled death threats against Georgia election workers, sexualized threats directed towards Raffensperger's wife, and harassment at the homes of Georgia election officials. The January 2nd call promised more of the same. The upshot of President Trump's message to Raffensperger was, "Do what I ask or you will pay." President Trump's phone call with Secretary Raffensperger received widespread coverage after it was leaked, but Georgia was not the only state targeted by President Trump and his allies. The call was one element of a larger and more comprehensive effort, much of it unseen by and unknown to the general public, to overturn the votes cast by millions of American citizens across several states. As Chapter 1 explained, the root of this effort was the big lie. President Trump and his allies publicly claiming that the election was rife with fraud that could have changed the result, even though the president's own advisors and the Department of Justice told the president time and time again that this was not the case. But in parallel with this strategy, President Trump and his allies zeroed in on key battleground states the president had lost, leaning on Republican state officials to overrule voters, disregard valid vote counts, and deliver the state's electoral votes to the losing candidate. Had this scheme worked, President Trump could have, for the first time in American history, subverted the results of a lawful election to stay in power. His was a deeply anti-democratic plan to co-opt state legislatures through appeals to debunked theories of election fraud or pure partisan politics, to replace Biden electors with Trump electors so President Trump would win the electoral vote count in the joint session of Congress on January 6th. Had enough state officials gone along with President Trump's plot, his attempt to stay in power might have worked. It is fortunate that a critical mass of honorable officials withstood President Trump's pressure to participate in this scheme. They and others who stood up to him closed off avenues for thwarting the election so that, by noon on January 6th, President Trump was left with one desperate final gambit for holding on to the power, sending his armed, angry supporters to the U.S. Capitol. The Electoral College and President Trump's attempt to subvert it. Oh, viewer. Good evening. Welcome. When Americans vote for a presidential candidate on Election Day, they are actually casting votes for that candidate's proposed presidential electors to participate in the Electoral College. After a state certifies its election results and announces a winner, it also issues a certificate of ascertainment, which contains the names of the duly chosen Electoral College electors. The electors whose names appear as having received the most votes on the certificate of ascertainment will go on to participate in the Electoral College, while a losing candidate's proposed electors have no role to play and no standing to participate in the Electoral College. This happens after every presidential election in each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. This process comes from a clause in the U.S. Constitution that gives states the power to choose Electoral College electors according to state law. That clause says that each state shall appoint Electoral College electors in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. All 50 states have decreed that electors will be selected by popular vote. Tuesday, November 3rd, was the day established by federal law as Election Day in 2020. Each state's rules had been set, and courts had weighed in when certain rules were challenged. Polls opened around the country, and votes came in, whether in person or via the mail, according to each state's laws. Over 154 million voters cast votes according to the rules in place on Election Day. President Trump lost. He and his supporters went to court, filing long-shot legal challenges to the election, but they failed in courts around the country before judges appointed by executives of both parties, including President Trump himself, and for those judges who were elected that are members of both parties. Rather than abiding by the rule of law and accepting the court's rulings, President Trump and his advisors tried every which way to reverse the outcome at the state level. They pressured local and state elections officials to stop counting votes once it became clear that former Vice President Joseph Biden would prevail in the final count. They pressured governors, secretaries of state, and local officials not to certify the popular vote in several swing states that former Vice President Biden had won. And when that did not work, they pressured state legislators to disregard the vote counts and instead appoint Trump electors to vote in the Electoral College. This fundamentally anti-democratic effort was premised on the incorrect theory that because the Constitution assigns to state legislatures the role of directing how Electoral College electors are chosen, which every state legislature had done before the election, giving that power to the people at the ballot boxes, then the state legislatures could simply choose Trump-Pence electors after seeing the election results. In effect, President Trump and his advisors pushed for the rules to be changed after the election, even if it meant disenfranchising millions of Americans. The plan emerges. More than a month before the presidential election, the media reported that the Trump campaign was already developing a fallback plan that would focus on overturning certain election results at the state level. An article published on September 23, 2020 in The Atlantic explained, according to sources in the Republican Party at the state and national levels, the Trump campaign is discussing contingency plans to bypass election results and appoint loyal electors in battleground states where Republicans hold the legislative majority. Ominously, the same reporting predicted almost exactly what would later come to pass. With a justification based on claims of rampant fraud, Trump would ask state legislators to set aside the popular vote and exercise their power to choose a slate of electors directly. Numerous senior Trump campaign advisors, including campaign manager William Stepien, deputy campaign manager and senior counsel Justin Clark, and President Trump's lead attorney Rudolph Giuliani, all told the Select Committee that there was indeed a state-focused strategy or track to challenge the outcome of the election, which included pressing state legislators to challenge results in key states and to appoint new Electoral College electors. You know, in the days after the election, later in that first week, bleeding into the second, as our numbers and data looked bleaker, internally we knew that, Stepien told the Select Committee. As the Associated Press called the race, I think some surrounding the president were looking for different avenues to pursue. That's when Stepien remembered the concept first coming up. Those around President Trump were pushing this idea and pushing it hard. Just 2 days after the election, President Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., forwarded to the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, a suggestion that state assemblies can step in and vote to put forward the electoral slate. Republicans control Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, etc. We get Trump electors. So we either have a vote we control and we win, or it gets kicked to Congress January 6th. Man, the kid's got bad grammar. gets kicked to Congress 6 January. Chief of Staff Meadows responded, working on this for Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina already. Within 1 week after the election, Meadows had also sent or received several other similar messages. The state legislature can take over the electoral process, Mark Meadows' text to Georgia State Senator Marty Harbin. Agreed, Mark Meadows' text to a different sender who suggested that the Trump administration should get that out there if they were seriously considering the state legislature strategy. I will tell him, Mark Meadows' text to a sender who suggested President Trump start building momentum for the state legislatures. I love it, said Mark Meadows in a text to Representative Andy Biggs, who relayed what he acknowledged as a highly controversial idea to have Republican legislatures appoint a look-doors electors? Wow. Why can't the states of Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and other Republican-controlled state houses declare that this is BS, where conflicts in election not called that night, and just send their own electors? I wonder if POTUS knows this. Former Secretary of Energy Rick Perry to Mark Meadows. Man, these people have terrible fucking grammar. Jesus. Another White House official exploring such a plan less than a week after the election was Vince Haley, Deputy Assistant to the President for Policy, Strategy, and Speechwriting. He suggested, imagine if every red state legislature slated 0 electors. It would reveal that we are a red country. Every red state legislature slated 0 electors? To do this, we would have to jack this to the nth degree as a battle of tribes. Haley pushed this strategy in several texts and emails, including to Assistant to the President and Director of Presidential Personnel Johnny McEntee. An individual Haley characterized as a very trusted lieutenant for President Trump, a direct conveyor to boss with ideas, and at his side almost all the time. For Haley, however, purported election fraud was a way to justify President Trump-friendly legislatures changing the outcome of the election, but there were other reasons for doing so, too. Election fraud was only one rationale for slating Trump electors, Haley told McEntee, and we should baldly assert that state legislators have the constitutional right to substitute their judgment for a certified majority of their constituents, if that prevents socialism. Haley added, independent of the fraud, or really along with that argument, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Madison, Wisconsin, Lansing, Michigan, do not have to sit idly by and submit themselves to rule by Beijing and Paris, proposing that radio hosts rally the grassroots to apply pressure to the weak-kneed legislators in those states. McEntee replied, yes, and then let's find the contact info for all those people now. Hours later, Haley sent him names and, in most cases, cell phone numbers for top GOP legislators in 6 states, suggesting for POTUS to invite them down for a White House meeting. The president would later call several named in that message, including Rusty Bowers and Karen Fann in Arizona, Lee Chatfield and Mike Shirkey in Michigan, and Jake Corman in Pennsylvania. Others weighed in with the president about a state-focused plan, too. Some were already looking ahead to January 6th. On November 8th, the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, met President Trump at the White House. Two days later, he sent a follow-up note to the president's executive assistant titled, "Please give to POTUS, Newt." So it suggested that the only way Trump loses is rigged system, and added that President Trump could encourage GOP legislatures elect not to send in electors, forcing a House vote by state delegations on January 6th that Gingrich expected President Trump to win. Meadows replied, "Thanks, Speaker." Newsmax CEO Christopher Ruddy had President's ear and reportedly spoke with him by phone at least 4 times before December. He forwarded a memo to other close advisors of the president recommending that the Trump team persuade one or more Republican-led chambers in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and even Minnesota to pick a separate competitive state slate of electors, which the memo predicted might turn January 6th into a catfight in Congress wherein VP Pence is presiding. Attorney and conservative activist Cleta Mitchell was recruited by Mark Meadows immediately after the election to assist the Trump campaign's legal work. By November 5th, she emailed Dr. John Eastman of Chapman University, who would later play an outsized role pushing a theory about what Vice President Pence could or couldn't do during the January 6th joint session of Congress that is detailed in Chapter 5 of this report. In her email, Mitchell asked Eastman to write a memo justifying an idea that state legislators reclaim the power to pick electors and asked rhetorically, "Am I crazy?" Dr. Eastman wrote the memo entitled "The Constitutional Authority of State Legislatures to Choose Electors" and sent it along for sharing widely. According to the Office of Presidential Scheduling, President Trump was scheduled to meet in the Oval Office on November 10th with Morgan Warstler and John Robeson Texas entrepreneurs close to former government Rick Perry. The next day, Wurzler tweeted that he was in Oval yesterday, and months later wrote that I told whole Trump team in Oval that state legislatures can choose the electors no matter what current state law or state courts say. After this apparent meeting, John Robeson sent the White House an email entitled Urgent follow-up to our Tuesday meeting with POTUS that he asked be printed out for the president to explain the move forward plan for what was discussed. The email stated that President Trump liked the plan we presented to use a parallel path of state legislators, and the attached memo proposed hundreds of briefings for state lawmakers by President Trump's surrogates and members of the Freedom Caucus. The email envisioned President Trump hosting 4+ monster rally trials with tens of thousands of Trump voters staring up at the GOP state legislators from their districts who alone control which slate of electors their state will submit. What the fuck? Briefings for state lawmakers. A proposal that seemed to foreshadow the state hearings that Rudy Giuliani and President Trump championed less than a month later. Deputy White House Chief of Staff Dan Scavino called Robeson's message batshit crazy. But the president's executive assistant, who was asked to print it for the president, wrote printed and may have shared it with the president anyway. By then, President Trump was enraged. According to Stepien, his campaign manager, the state-focused strategy came up in a According to Stepien, his campaign manager, the state-focused strategy came up in a November 11th meeting among close advisors as something to consider. At that point, the election had been called, but the president was very interested in keeping pathways to victory open, so Stepien believed the president found the concept intriguing. Then, the plan just started happening, even though it was something Stepien honestly kind of dismissed at hand, characterizing it as one of the crazier ideas that was thrown out in and around that time. But not everyone was convinced. On November 19th, the prior Republican presidential nominee, Senator Mitt Romney, issued a harsh public condemnation of President Trump's open and notorious efforts to overturn the election. Quote, having failed to make even a plausible case of widespread fraud or conspiracy before a court of law, the president has now resorted to overt pressure on state and local officials to subvert the will of the people and overturn the election. It is difficult to imagine a worse, more undemocratic action by a sitting American president. Where is this? 270. Senator Romney was right to identify and decry President Trump's actions. And yet, in hindsight, it is clear that the effort to pressure state and local officials by the Trump team was only just getting started. Just one day after the state focus plan came up in the Oval Office with the president and his top lieutenants, President Trump started taking concrete steps aimed at state legislators. And in the weeks that followed, the president spearheaded outreach aimed at numerous officials in states he lost, but that had GOP-led legislatures, including in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona. The Select Committee estimates that in the 2 months between the November election and the January 6th insurrection, President Trump and his inner circle engaged in at least 200 apparent acts of public or private outreach, pressure, or condemnation targeting either state legislators or state or local election administrators to overturn state election results. Wow. This included at least 68 meetings, attempted or connected phone calls or text messages, each aimed at one or more state or local officials, 18 instances of prominent public remarks with language targeting one or more such officials, and 125 social media posts by President Trump or senior aides targeting one or more such officials, either explicitly or implicitly, and mostly from his own account, from his own social media account. Furthermore, these efforts by President Trump's team also involved 2 other initiatives that tried to enlist support from large numbers of state legislators all at once. The Trump campaign contacted or attempted to contact nearly 200 state legislators from battleground states between November 30th and December 3rd to solicit backing for possible state house resolutions to overturn the election. At least some messages said they were on behalf of the president. Nearly 300 state legislators from battleground states reportedly participated in a private briefing with President Trump, Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, and others on January 2nd. The president reportedly urged them to exercise what he called the real power to choose electoral votes before January 6th because, as President Trump said on the call, "I don't think the country is going to take it." It may be impossible to document each and every meeting, phone call, text message, or other contact that Trump and his allies had with state and local officials in various battleground states. What follows is a summary that focuses on 4 states and that demonstrates the lengths to which President Trump would go in order to stay in power based on lies, the big lie about the election. President Trump's early pressure on public servants. To carry out his plan, President Trump, Rudy Giuliani, and other surrogates of Trump publicly and privately sought assistance from state and local officials whom they assumed would help as Republicans on the same team with the same goal. Some helped, others didn't. On November 12th, U.S. Representative Tim Walberg sent an email to President Trump's executive assistant Molly Michael describing a request he had received earlier that day. Quote, "During my conversation with the president this morning, he asked me to check with key leadership in Michigan's legislature as to how supportive they could be in regards to pushing back on election irregularities and potential fraud. He wanted me to gauge their willingness to talk with him about efforts to bring about transparency and integrity in Michigan's election and report back to him." Representative Walberg added that he had already acted on this request. "I've had conversations with Michigan Speaker Lee Chatfield, Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey, and Senate President pro tempore Eric Nesbitt. They all assured me that they would look forward to speaking with the president to report on their continuing efforts related to overseeing the election and receiving any suggestions from President Trump. The president would soon host Chatfield, Shirkey, Nesbitt, and 4 other Michigan state lawmakers at the White House. In Arizona on November 13th, 2020, the day after officials finished counting ballots cast in Maricopa County, Chairwoman Kelly Ward of the Arizona Republican Party texted Mark Meadows that she had just talked to POTUS and that he may call the chairman of the Maricopa Board of Supervisors, Clint Hickman. Howdy, viewer. Ward also left a message for Hickman that said, I just talked to President Trump, and he would like me to talk to you and also see if he needs to give you a call to discuss what's happening on the ground in Maricopa. Give me a call back when you can. According to Hickman, Ward was unusually active after the election, even for a party chair, and was the first person to pressure him. One of her first messages to Hickman before trying to connect him with President Trump was, "We need you to stop the counting." In Georgia, the president initially took a more public approach. After the Associated Press called the race there on November 12th, President Trump tweeted harsh criticisms of Governor Brian Kemp and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. Often these tweets called for them to take specific actions that would have shifted the election results in his favor, such as rejecting a court settlement, which he referred to as a consent decree, that dictated the procedures for verifying signatures on absentee ballots. He was relentless. In November alone, President Trump tweeted that Raffensperger was a so-called rhino, and asked, where is Brian Kemp before suggesting that they knew they were going to cheat. He called to break the unconstitutional consent decree and urged stricter signature matches with a demand to get it done, Brian Kemp. He called Kemp hapless and asked why he wouldn't use emergency powers to overrule Raffensperger on the signature verification procedures, declaring that Georgia Republicans are angry. President Trump also retweeted posts asking who needs Democrats when you have Republicans like Brian Kemp, and why bother voting for Republicans if what you get is Ducey and Kemp. Pennsylvania was an early but not unique example of how President Trump's state pressure campaign affected the lives of the public servants running this country's elections. On November 7th, Rudy Giuliani headlined a Philadelphia press conference in front of a landscaping business called the Four Seasons Total Landscaping near a crematorium and down the street from a sex shop. Standing in front of the former New York police commissioner and recently pardoned convicted felon Bernard Kerik, Giuliani gave opening remarks and handed the podium over to his first supposed eyewitness to election fraud, who turned out to be a convicted sex offender. Giuliani claimed that at least 600,000 ballots are in question, holy shit, in Pennsylvania, and falsely suggested that large numbers of ballots in the state had been cast for dead people, including boxer Joe Frazier and actor Will Smith's father. Within days, Republican Philadelphia City Commissioner Al Schmidt and others publicly debunked Giuliani's specific allegations of election fraud, including the claims about dead people voting in Pennsylvania elections. In reaction, President Trump tweeted on the morning of November 11th that a guy named Al Schmidt, a Philadelphia commissioner and so-called Republican rhino, is being used big time by the fake news media to explain how honest things were with respect to the election in Philadelphia. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption and dishonesty. We win. That statement targeting Schmidt led to a deluge of threatening and harassing phone calls and emails by people who heard President Trump and falsely held out hope that Schmidt or someone else could overturn the results of Pennsylvania's election. As a public official, Schmidt was no stranger to threats, but being targeted by the President of the United States was different. In Schmidt's public testimony to the Select Committee, he described why. Prior to that, the threats were pretty general in nature. corrupt election officials in Philadelphia are going to get what's coming to them, and other similar threats. After the president tweeted at me by name, calling me out the way he did, Schmidt explained, the threats became much more specific, much more graphic, and included not just me by name, but included members of my family by name, their ages, addresses, pictures of our home, just every bit of detail you could imagine. Holy shit. Doxed Schmidt. As the president continued to push the big lie and vilify public officials, such threats multiplied. Efforts to prevent state and local officials from certifying the election. Some of President Trump's early outreach was part of an effort to prevent state and local officials from certifying his loss. One example comes from Michigan and the other from Arizona. Wayne County, Michigan includes Detroit and its surrounding areas. On November 17th, the county's Board of Canvassers met to certify election results, a process the Michigan Supreme Court described over a century ago as ministerial and clerical. The meeting started at 6 p.m. and lasted over 3 hours. Its two Republican members, Board Chair Monica Palmer and Board Member William Hartman, first voted to block the certification of the election. Wow. And William Hartman. Monica Palmer and William Hartman. After a brief break, Palmer and Hartman returned, changed their votes, and certified the election results. Just over 20 minutes later, Palmer and Hartman received a call from Trump and RNC Chair Ronna McDaniel. Palmer claimed that the call was not pressure. Rather, she said, it was genuine concern for my safety, and there were general comments about different states, but we really didn't discuss the details of the certification. The Select Committee doesn't know exactly what President Trump privately said on that phone call. By the next evening, however, Palmer and Hartman had each issued signed affidavits reassuming their earlier position that Wayne County's election results could not be certified. Palmer's affidavit even declared that I rescind my prior vote, though rescinding wasn't possible and her statement had no legal effect. And President Trump apparently knew before it was public that Hartman and Palmer would try to change their votes, almost 8 hours before either of these affidavits were publicly released. Almost 8 hours before they were released, President Trump tweeted that these two harassed patriotic canvassers refused to sign the papers. Harassed patriotic canvassers. Republicans in Arizona experienced similar treatment. In the most populous and electorally significant county in Arizona, Maricopa County's Board of Supervisors met on November 20th to certify the county's election results. Their board, made up of 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat, carefully reviewed the official canvass, asked questions for approximately 2 hours, then unanimously voted to certify the results. Earlier that day, Kelly Ward contacted 2 of the board's members, Jack Sellers and Bill Gates. Bill Gates? Like Bill Gates? Bill Gates? And asked them to delay the certification on the basis of supposed improprieties. According to Sellers and Gates, however, Arizona law required certification that day, and they had no information to doubt the county's election results. When Arizona certified its 2020 statewide election results on November 30th, it fell to Governor Greg Ducey, a Republican, to sign the certification. While on camera during the signing ceremony, Governor Ducey's phone played a ringtone for the song Hail to the Chief, which he immediately silenced. Hail to the Chief as Trump's ringtone. The governor later confirmed it had been President Trump calling, and when he returned the president's call shortly afterwards, but declined to say what the two discussed other than saying that President Trump did not ask him to withhold certification. The Select Committee does not know whether this is true, but that evening Trump blasted Ducey on Twitter, accusing him of rushing to put a Democrat in office and warning that Republicans will long remember. The president also retweeted posts bashing Ducey and his Georgia counterpart Brian Kemp, which asked, "Who needs Democrats when you have Republicans like Brian Kemp and Doug Ducey? Why bother voting for Republicans if what you get is Ducey and Kemp? And Brian Kemp, my state ran the most corrupt election in American history. Doug Ducey, hold my beer." President Trump even commented "true" when retweeting a post that Governor Ducey has betrayed the people of Arizona. Governor Ducey pushed back, writing on Twitter that "I've been pretty outspoken about Arizona's election system and bragged about it quite a bit, including in the Oval Office. In Arizona, we have some of the strongest election laws in the country. The problems that exist in other states simply don't apply here." Governor Ducey explained the law for certifying elections in Arizona and pointed out that the certification now triggered a 5-day window for any elector to bring a credible challenge to the election results in court. "If you want to contest the results, now is the time. Bring your challenges." And Governor Ducey referenced his oath of office. Quote, "That's the law. I've sworn an oath to uphold it, and I take my responsibility seriously." President Trump and his allies never brought a credible challenge, and instead lost every case they brought challenging the results in Arizona. They sure did. Efforts to replace Electoral College electors and overturn the election. Once counties and states certified the election, or when it was nearly certain that they would, President Trump and his team's focus largely shifted. President Trump and his team encouraged state legislators to meet in special sessions if necessary and choose Electoral College electors who would vote for the Trump-Pence ticket. Ultimately, no state legislature took that step, but it was the basis for pressuring state officials from November through January 6, 2021. Meetings with state legislators, the hearings. The concept of state legislatures appointing their own electors featured prominently in a series of hastily arranged official and unofficial hearings with state legislators that the Trump team announced on November 24, 2020. On November 25th, President Trump called in to an unofficial meeting with legislators in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The meeting was set up to appear like an official hearing, but it was not. It took place in a hotel ballroom, and those presenting arguments or purported evidence, like Giuliani, Jenna Ellis, and others, were not placed under oath. Of course. According to President pro tempore of the Pennsylvania Senate, Jake Corman, he had initially been asked by State Senator Doug Mastriano to hold a hearing about the election. Corman responded that any formal hearing should be official, with sworn testimony and open to both parties. That was not what Senator Mastriano ultimately convened. Open to both parties, that's important. Sworn testimony is good too. President Trump had originally made plans to attend the Pennsylvania gathering in person, but he canceled after several advisors tested positive for COVID-19. When President Trump called in and spoke to those gathered in the hotel ballroom, his false claims were met with cheers, and he made his purpose clear. Quote, "This election has to be turned around. Why wouldn't they overturn an election? Certainly overturn it in your state. We have to turn the election over." President Trump made the ask, and Giuliani told the legislators how to carry it out. Giuliani told the assembled legislators that it was their power and responsibility to pick Pennsylvania's presidential electors, and that they have to convince the rest of their members, Republican and Democrat, that they owe that to the people of Pennsylvania. Jenna Ellis told them that although Pennsylvania law dictates that electors are chosen by popular vote, you can take that power back at any time. You don't need a court to tell you that. President Trump invited some of the lawmakers to come meet him at the White House that evening, and according to Giuliani, it was a large group that went. Special assistant to the president, Cassidy Hutchinson's text messages with Carrick included the guest lists and descriptions of the vehicles that would need access to the White House grounds. Pennsylvania State Senator Doug Mastriano drove one car, a hired driver drove a van with most of the state legislators, and Carrick drove an SUV with attorney Catherine Freese and election conspiracy proponent Phil Waldron. Hutchinson estimated that at least 29 visitors traveled from Pennsylvania to the White House that day, and she explained that their conversation with the president touched on holding a special session of the state legislature to appoint Trump electors. Just a few days later, on November 30th, 2020, President Trump also called in to another one of Giuliani and Jenna Ellis's hotel hearings, this time in Arizona. Actually, 277. Several Arizona state lawmakers hosted the meeting at a Hyatt Regency in Phoenix after they did not receive permission to organize an official hearing at the state capitol. Before the hearing started, state GOP Representative Mark Finchem proposed new information to show that the state's 11 electoral votes should not go to Joe Biden, and argued that the U.S. Constitution empowers lawmakers to decide on their own whether the election was valid and, if not, to select the electors of their choice. Giuliani told the assembled legislators that the officials certifying Arizona's election results have made no effort to find out if the results of the election were accurate. Which seems to me gives the state legislature a perfect reason to take over the conduct of this election because it's being conducted irresponsibly and unfairly. Likewise, Jenna Ellis said that it was not just the choice, but the actual duty and obligation of the legislature to step in and to make sure that you don't certify false results. During a recess, she also took to Twitter, writing, "The certification of Arizona's false results is unethical and knowingly participating in the corruption that has disenfranchised Arizona voters. But this in no way impacts the state legislature's ability to take back the proper selection of delegates." When it was President Trump's turn to address this handful of lawmakers over the phone, he called them legends for taking this on, and used the opportunity to criticize Governor Ducey. You'll have to figure out what's that all about with Ducey. He couldn't certify fast enough, and Arizona will not forget what Ducey just did. We're not going to forget. That night, Giuliani joined President Trump in criticizing Governor Ducey, while at the same time making baseless allegations about voting machines in Arizona and calling for a special legislative session to change the outcome of the election. Governor Ducey of Arizona refuses to meet with me. He doesn't want to explain that he selected a foreign corrupt voting machine company to count the vote. I understand his reluctance, but just call a special session. Let's find out how crooked your election really was. Michigan was next. Giuliani's team announced that the Michigan legislature would hold a hearing on December 1st, but the relevant committee chair excluded Giuliani because it was only open to witnesses with first-hand knowledge. That chairman, Michigan State Senator Edward McBroom, Republican, had already held Senate oversight hearings by then in an actual effort to evaluate claims of fraud in the 2020 election, which ultimately resulted in a comprehensive report that concluded that the Republican-led committee found no evidence of widespread or systematic fraud in Michigan's election. Welcome back, viewer. Michigan's House Oversight Committee, however, did allow Giuliani to testify in a hearing on December 2nd. Before the hearing, Giuliani joined the state's GOP chairwoman to give what was billed as a legal briefing. In the online presentation, Giuliani told the audience there's nothing wrong with putting pressure on your state legislators to pick new electors, and that you have to get them to remember their oath to the Constitution sometimes requires being criticized. Sometimes it even requires being threatened. When Giuliani appeared for the hearing in Michigan, he was not placed under oath. He used his time to refer to Michigan's election as a con job and urged legislators to have the courage to say that certification that was done by your state is a complete phony. The information presented was baseless and sometimes racist conspiracy theories. One witness brought to criticize Michigan's voter verification even said, quote, "I think Chinese all look alike, so how would you tell? If some chow shows up, you can be anybody and you can vote." Wow. And as he had promised in the legal briefing the day before, Giuliani then called on the legislators to do what the Trump campaign had reportedly been discussing since before Election Day. He said that the state legislature could still single-handedly decide the election result anytime you want to, anytime. You can take it back tonight. You can take it back the day before the electors go down to Washington. Jenna Ellis also participated, insisting that no honest person can hear these citizens of your own state today and can let this proceed. What the Constitution obligates you to do is to take back your plenary power. Finally, Georgia. There, Giuliani and others appeared in multiple hearings, the first of which was held on December 3rd, 2020. In that hearing, Giuliani was direct and called on Georgia legislators to overturn the election results. Quote, "You are the final arbiter of who the electors should be," based on the false premise that, quote, "there is more than ample evidence to conclude that this election was a sham." Then, at a separate hearing on December 10th, he told state legislators that Georgia's governor, lieutenant governor, and secretary of state were engaged in a cover-up of a crime in plain sight, and that it fell to the state legislature to vindicate the honor of the state. And Giuliani used yet another appearance on December 30th to call the 2020 election the most crooked election, the most manipulated election in American history, and implore the Republican legislators to hold a special session to vote on appointing new electors. Something he said that they could do right up until the last moment before January 6th. More perniciously, Giuliani also used these hearings to advance conspiracy theories that falsely accused Fulton County election workers of rigging Georgia's election results. His delegation to the December 3rd hearing played clips of election night surveillance footage from the State Farm Arena that showed election workers scanning ballots, sometimes after partisan poll watchers had gone home. Although the poll watchers should have been there the entire time while election workers counted the votes, there was nothing nefarious about the circumstances and no question about the end result. Remember, they were audited, they were checked against the machine counts, they were within one or two ballots. In fact, the FBI, Department of Justice, and Georgia Bureau of Investigation would determine that these ballots were legitimate ballots, that observers were not illegally ejected, and that the ballots were scanned and counted properly, contrary to claims by President Trump and his attorneys. And yet Giuliani baselessly declared at the December 3rd hearing that to him, the video was a powerful smoking gun, proving that those votes are not legitimate votes. But Giuliani's claims took a more ominous turn during the December 10th hearing. There, he publicly named two of the election workers shown in the video, Ruby Freeman and her daughter Wandrea Arche Moss, and accused them of vote tampering and engaging in criminal conduct. He seized on a clip of Freeman passing Moss a ginger mint, claiming that the two women, both black, were smuggling USB drives as if they're vials of heroin or cocaine. He also suggested that Freeman and Moss should be jailed and that they deserve to have their homes searched. Not only were Giuliani's claims about Freeman and Moss reckless, racist, and false, they had real-world consequences that turned both women's lives upside down. And further heightening the personal impact of these baseless attacks, President Trump supported and even repeated them as described later. In the end, the hearings were widely panned. In Michigan alone, current and former Republican lawmakers publicly questioned the hearings and implored President Trump and his team to stop. U.S. Representative Paul Mitchell implored on Twitter, "Please just stop," and wondered why Republican leaders allowed testimony he said was driving the party into this ditch. Similarly, former Michigan lawmaker Martin Hawrylak said that he was embarrassed by the hearing, and former Michigan Senator Ken Sikkema said that the way the committee was run was atrocious. Later, the president promoted a tweet calling a Democratic lawmaker a #piece of shit for speaking out at the Michigan hearing. Months later, Giuliani's license to practice law in New York was suspended for, among other reasons, the false claims he made on various dates, including during the hearings in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia. The Trump campaign's barrage of phone calls to state legislators. Not only was replacing electors a theme during the official and unofficial state hearings, it was also a critical component of President Trump's plan both before and after the hearings took place. In fact, while the hearings were happening, the Trump campaign set up an operation to contact hundreds of state legislators and ask them to support an effort to appoint Electoral College electors for the Trump-Pence ticket in states that President Trump had lost. Just blatant. Blatantly asking for the wrong slates of electors. While the hearings were happening, the Trump campaign set up an operation to contact hundreds of state legislators and ask them to support an effort to appoint Electoral College electors for the Trump-Pence ticket in states that President Trump had lost. On the same day as Giuliani's hearing in Michigan, Trump campaign staff contacted dozens of Republicans in Michigan's state legislature. A Trump campaign supervisor sent text messages to his team, directing them to reach out to lawmakers to explain the process for legislative redress and tell them how to send representatives to the Electoral College. He added, "We're going to be lobbyists, woot." According to a campaign staffer's spreadsheet produced to the Select Committee, the Trump campaign apparently tried contacting over 190 Republican state legislators in Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan alone. One voicemail left as part of this initiative was leaked to the press on December 1st, 2020. In it, a Trump campaign staffer said, I did want to personally reach out to you on behalf of the president. Her main point came later in the message. We want to know when there is a resolution in the House to appoint electors for Trump if the president can count on you to join in support. Another message from this effort that reached reporters made the same ask and claimed that After a roundtable with the president, he asked us to reach out to you individually to whip support for a joint resolution from the state, House, and Senate that would allow Michigan to send electors for Donald J. Trump to the Electoral College and save our country. Soon after the voicemail leaked, the campaign staffer who left this voicemail got a text message from one of her supervisors who wrote, "Honest to God, I'm so proud of this because they unwittingly just got your message out there." He elaborated, "You used the awesome power of the presidency to scare a state rep into getting a statewide newspaper to deliver your talking points." Holy shit. That's why they won. Because they know how to play the media. I gotta get me some water. I will be right back. Okay. Outreach by President Trump and senior aides. While campaign aides blanketed state officials with these calls, some state officials received more personalized outreach directly from President Trump, Giuliani, and their allies throughout the post-election period about this issue. Oh, stand by. Michigan. As discussed earlier, Representative Wahlberg reached out to state legislators in Michigan at the president's request in mid-November, including Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey and House Speaker Lee Chatfield. By November 18th, President Trump called Chatfield and Shirkey to invite them to what would become a meeting for a group of Michigan lawmakers in the Oval Office. Although President Trump didn't tell Shirkey what the meeting would be about, the president was focused on the election and asked Shirkey what he and the others were doing to investigate election fraud. The meeting happened on November 20th. In Shirkey's words, there wasn't a mystery about why the group was at the White House once the meeting started. When the president mentioned several baseless claims of election fraud in Wayne County, Shirkey told the president that he had lost the election and that it had nothing to do with Wayne County, where he had actually performed better than he had in 2016. From the president's body language, Shirkey concluded that wasn't what he wanted to hear. But the meeting continued, and the president dialed in Giuliani, who delivered a long monologue reciting a litany of allegations about supposed fraud that was short on substance. Shirkey challenged Giuliani, asking, "When are you going to file a lawsuit in Michigan?" which he said Giuliani did not answer. Although Shirkey says he did not recall the president making any precise ask, Chatfield recalled President Trump's more generic directive for the group to have some backbone and do the right thing. Where was this? Georgia? No, Michigan. Chatfield understood that to mean they should investigate claims of fraud and overturn the election by naming electors for President Trump. Shirkey told the president that he was not going to do anything that would violate Michigan law. After the meeting ended, Shirkey and Chatfield issued a joint statement. "We have not yet been made aware of any information that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan, and as legislative leaders, we will follow the law and follow the normal process regarding Michigan's electors, just as we have said throughout this election." That was not the end, however. Chatfield and Shirkey received numerous calls from the president in the weeks following the election. Chatfield told the Select Committee that he received approximately 5 to 10 phone calls from President Trump after the election, during which the president would usually ask him about various allegations of voter fraud. Chatfield said that he repeatedly looked into the president's claims but never found anything persuasive that could have changed the outcome of the election. President Trump's calls were not enough, so he turned to the public. On January 3rd, 2021, the Trump campaign posted a tweet that urged supporters to contact Speaker Lee Chatfield and Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey and demand a vote on decertification. Why President Trump thought the Michigan legislature would convene to decertify the election in a matter of hours when it had refused to do so since early November is not clear. But that didn't stop the president from making things personal. The president's January 3rd tweet included Shirkey's personal cell phone number, as well as a number for Chatfield that turned out to be wrong. As a result, Shirky said he received nearly 4,000 text messages, and another private citizen reported being inundated with calls and texts intended for Chatfield. Hey, check 1, 2. Sounds fine to me. All right, let's try and organize what we just read. Welcome back, viewer. Just going through my notes quietly. right, good night, y'all.